Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming to on-site here at Spui 25 in Amsterdam and at home, of course, behind your laptop or computer. We're really happy to have this NIAS talk in a hybrid form still. We call this a NIAS talk because every month the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study has a talk where the Institute presents one or more, in this case 3, of its fellows to the Dutch and international audience. The Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies is an institute that selects and invites scholars, journalists and artists from all over the world to work on a project of their own, based on their own curiosity, to research, to work and together in an interdisciplinary and international environment. And today we will discuss how cinema and TV industry affect the spatial value of European cities. And we will explore the relationship between film and city generation. And we will do this with one of our fellows who will give the keynote lecture in about 20, that will take about 20 minutes. And this is İpek Çelis Rapas, and she is an associate professor at the Media and Visual Arts at Koç University in Turkey. And she is a NIAS fellow from September. She started in September and she will be with us until January. And she is fascinated by the world behind cameras. And during this talk, İpek Rapas will explore how the production process of film and television has impact on people living in these locations. And her NIAS project, the project that she is working on at this moment, is called Instant Throwaway Europe, Producing Space and Value on Screen. And after İpek's talk, we will have 2 respondents, Naluembe Benaissa and Asma Mehan, who will respond to her in 8 to 10 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion and the space is open for questions. For those at home, if you have questions, please feel free to add your question post your question via #NIAStalk. And then we have Zara Kars here in the house, who will make sure that your question is posed here and answered by one of the speakers. So, thank you very much. Can I have an applause for İpek Rapas from Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fenneke. Thank you, Zara, for organizing, and I'd like to thank NIAS, of course, and Nalu and Asma for responding. So I'll try to talk about my book project today. I'm a media studies scholar, and my book examines the relationship, film and television's relationship with the location where it is produced. And the question that concerns my work is, how does film and TV production increase the value, and often what I'm mentioning is a real estate value, of a city and sometimes a particular site and neighborhood where the film is or the TV series is being made. And so I explore both how screen represents the city, but also how production practices, when they go and they're made in a particular place, how they have an impact on that place. And I indeed try to look behind the camera to see who is making the film, where, and what are the location-related difficulties that these people face. And what problems do they themselves bring to the location when they film it. To conduct this research, I interviewed, and it was quite a fun experience to interview these people. I interviewed from people ranging from art directors to line producers who work on the site, and especially people who find locations, and they're called location scouts, which is interestingly quite a colonial language, but they're called location scouts. So I interviewed them in cities including Athens, Belfast, Istanbul, and Paris. So in 50s and 60s, European cities that have been locations for US screen productions were often portrayed as tempting tourist locations. If you have seen these films, Roman Holiday, Never on a Sunday, you have these beautiful images of Athens and Rome, right? And the characters are often seeking pleasure and going to heritage places, and they're seeking their soul, they're seeking liberty, they're seeking passion. On the other hand, places like Belfast, for instance, in Northern Ireland, they only appear in Hollywood films in relation to civil conflict there. So these places don't really get much Hollywood attention. Now, however, what happens, for instance, and this is the picture on the left is a former warehouse, actually where they painted the Titanic when Titanic was made. So now it is one of the major studios where the famous Iron Throne is held. Well, they tried to put Queen Elizabeth on the throne, but she actually rejected to sit on it. But the throne is there, and nobody can enter but the Queen. So you know, now basically the warehouse area that was basically for a long time was like a dump area was used for Game of Thrones, and Athens, for instance, that was pictured in this magnificent way is now, after the financial crisis, in international productions such as Jason Bourne, and more recently, if you've seen Beckett in Netflix, it's a Netflix original, Athens appears as a site of crisis and protests. So the image, the representation really changed of the city. And this changed in Greek films also. So you see the architecture of abandoned locations in decay after the economic crisis. They often become metaphors for crisis. So in a film called Park, the crumbling Olympic Park becomes a playground for unemployed youth. In a sci-fi short called Third Kind, the abandoned Ellinikon airport represents post-apocalyptic Earth. So I talked to a location scout in Athens, I'll call her Maria, and she explained to me how she always likes to find new locations for directors and producers. I quote, "The idea is to see Athens as we haven't seen it before. I want to show the ugly, beautiful Athens. For me, it's important to find spaces in my city and show them." Unquote. So Maria's desire to show Athens in a non-touristic, non-stereotypical, and unusual light for film and TV spectators is shared by location scouts I interviewed in other European cities. They always want to find fresh locations, and directors always want fresh locations. So this desire often leads to shooting in affordable yet struggling locations, especially for art films, actually. And in the meanwhile, drawing attention to devalued yet still aesthetically appealing, in Maria's words, ugly, beautiful vistas of the city. Production locations that scouts discover in neglected neighborhoods are often sites that real estate websites also suggest as the best neighborhoods to invest in, with lowest property prices and the highest potential yields. So if you'd like to buy property, watch films that show, you know, the city could be useful. Film and TV, similar to other creative industries, increase the market value, at times contribute to the gentrification of a location, thanks to pretty or dream screen images. But I argue that it's not only images of and image making in dream locations, but those in ruined and struggling urban sites that actually show the highest speculation premise. By such sites, I mean places such as decrepit former industrial buildings or low-income neighborhoods under neglect. And what I call speculative shootings is film and television industry's ability to enter, reshape, produce and exit rapidly and portray ruined urban sites both as aesthetically valuable as well as moldable and destroyable spaces. So today I'll focus mainly on film and video productions in former factories. Film crews find it appealing to work in demolition and construction sites and abandoned factories and warehouses because these locations, in these locations, ordinary rules like keeping them clean and tidy, they don't really matter. They're not only empty spaces that can be filled with fictional narratives, but also they can often be easily destroyed. Furthermore, their former usage and state of decay that is traceable on them contribute to visual aesthetics. One of such filming locations is Beckton Gasworks in the east of London. So this is a factory that once considered the largest of its kind, and it was closed in mid-70s. You might have seen Full Metal Jacket. Around the time when the area was being regenerated, Stanley Kubrick shot the war scenes in Vietnam, actually. What you see there is not Vietnam. They probably planted some palm trees there, and it's actually a factory in, a former factory in London, in east of London. So Kubrick's assistant describes the reasons for their locational choice as such. If Stanley could have shot Full Metal Jacket in his back garden, he would have. It wasn't so much that he didn't like to travel, he just didn't see the necessity of it. Instead, we found Beckton Gasworks, which was constructed by the same company of architects that built in the city of Hue, Vietnam. All we had to do was to dress it up, put signs on it, and blow it up, unquote. He also underlines the haste with which they shot war and explosion scenes, since the place was scheduled for demolition. The post-industrial site was later used for multiple music videos, including The Smiths, The Queen is Dead, in which a young boy writes the song title on its walls, and Oasis's single, Do You Know What I Mean? I really don't know what they mean in the song, and there's all these helicopters flying, bombs, like colorful bombs being thrown. They seem like they're really kind of these young people walking, not much meaning. And on the song you see the title of the song in Czech, of all languages, emblazoned on one of the half-destroyed factory buildings. It's a major production that I would think would have damaged the place as it is, because it required a lot of, it was a big kind of video production. Both music videos and the film portray a possessive attitude towards this deteriorating building up for grabs, which easily gives in to be dressed up, signed up, and blown up. Full Metal Jacket turns a former gas plant in London into Vietnam and makes the location interchangeable, fill it with its fictional narrative. The filmmaking practice makes it possible to conjure the location as one that can be destroyed and refunctioned. This speculative vision gives an elastic sense to space. Screen images of ruined locations suggest both their durable value as aesthetically appealing sites and their decor-like quality that can be remade, like decors in sets in film studios. Screen images become both archives of what the place looks like, and then kind of, you know, when it disappears, the film keeps its value, and sometimes the film in its production destroys the place. So today, screen productions that use these spaces are not only war films or edgy music videos. Here you have engagement, photography. You know, people go to, it's a place in, it's a warehouse, a famous warehouse in California where people go and have their picture taken right after their engagement. And that's an ad for Puma. So fashion shoots, commercials, and engagement photography even use these locations to make the ruined aesthetic attractive and visible. A production manager in Istanbul told me that these kind of places are very much in demand for global marques like Nike, Adidas, especially. They used to demand very clean, pristine locations. Now more and more these brands that want to attract young people prefer these kind of locations. So screen production initiates the revaluation of such sites through culture economy, using them without the need for renovation and during the period before any sort of regeneration, before anybody can actually enter into them. An unprecedented entry of screen professionals in disaffected sites forces them to work in these locations in spite of the lack of appropriate infrastructure. So when I asked a Paris-based location scout, Anne, if she ever worked in a ruined and abandoned location, she told me about her most recent experience of working in an art house movie about refugees. So this is, I'm sorry, it's a long quote, but it really reflects the point that I'd like to make here. I worked for a film in Lyon. The film was about undocumented migrants. I had to find a location where undocumented migrants squat. So I went to scout in abandoned buildings. I entered into very damaged buildings in which electricity is cut. There was a real danger already due to the building's state of decay and risk of collapse. But it was also very bizarre because most of the time I was in places that had been or were being used as squats. In one former factory, once I saw tons of candles. It was impossible to know if there were still people there. Undocumented migrants who live in these squats are precarious individuals who hide and don't want to be discovered. So really, I didn't know who would be afraid of whom in the story. Because I, a woman all by herself in a dark abandoned factory, am in a vulnerable position. But these people, those people, there is a stake for them as well, equally vital, of not being discovered and not being denounced to the police. So I had an impression of playing cat and mouse and not knowing who is the cat and who is the mouse, unquote. Now, Anne's answer makes evident the difficulties of working in an abandoned and crumbling site. When scouting in such locations, she's in a precarious position due to their isolation, lack of lighting, and structural decay, not knowing exactly what she's stepping on, but also not being certain of who she may come across. In order to take precaution, she told me that she turned on her GPS and she was talking to her husband the whole time, and at the same time as she was fumbling to take pictures in the dark. Her account also shows her sensitivity towards individuals who may take refuge in these locations. So Anne was aware of her position as enabler of entry and potential appropriation of a location by the screen industry, and how this may have an impact on precarious populations squatting in this location, revealing her reflexivity and dilemma as a scout. So scouting for a film about undocumented migrants puts the actual undocumented migrants squatting in an abandoned location in a vulnerable position. Then, if and when such ruined, vacant, squatted locations are used for film production, this production may not only endanger the crew members working in these locations, but it may also drive away and dispossess the populations whose struggles the film aims to depict. In conclusion, so when we consider a screen economy and its relationship with a place, we need to pay attention when it's about extracting value, what I'd like to say, there is a three-way extraction. So when we talk about precarity of a place, of a location, we should also connect that to the people who are living there, who feel like they belong to this place, and who also are working in this place. So the value extracted from the fragility of a location that is left in a liminal state before large sums of investment into creative transformation is put there can only be made possible thanks to the precarity of freelance and mobile screen labor that enters into essentially unsafe work environments and render them attractive for the screen. Then in order for screen economy to function in these zones, it often exploits the vulnerability of communities who feel or have felt belonging to these locations, be they clandestine refugees, homeless, discharged workers, or low-income populations in a gentrifying neighborhood. These communities are either pushed aside for production practices to proceed or are employed as affordable labor. Or they are dispossessed, either they are dispossessed so that cameras can enter into a location, or once cameras clean and leave the site, making it visible and available for creative use. So I underline that not only blockbuster action films, but also progressive art films about refugee rights may in fact neglect or harm the very populations whose rights these films set out to promote during their production. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ipek Rappas. That was a wonderful and very visual, beautiful talk, and I think we have a lot to discuss. I would like to welcome our two respondents of today, who are also, like Ipek, NIAS Fellows. And first I would like to invite on stage Naluembe Binaisa. She is an interdisciplinary scholar with a focus on visual and migration studies. And at NIAS she is a guest of the director and part of the theme group called Refuge and Belonging. And she's working on her NIAS project is called Architectures of Fear, Visuality, Mobilities and Identities. Naluembe, come to the stage. Thank you. Give her a warm applause. You can take a seat. And our second respondent of today is Asma Mehan. She's an educator, urban researcher and an architect, and she is affiliated to Leiden University, and she has researched and practiced architecture in Europe, Asia and Australia. And at NIAS, Asma holds an Urban Citizen Fellowship supported by the Municipality of Amsterdam, and her project deals with the social cultural character of port cities' public spaces. Asma, welcome. Applause. Well, thank you both for being here and wanting to respond to Ipek. Nalu, can I ask you to start responding?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a great talk, Ipek. So I have a few comments I'll read to keep time. So I'm really reflecting from the space of having lived and worked in London and Lagos, and I'm thinking about this triple exposure to precarity that you have presented, and the interface between locals, the apparatus of film production, and the built environment. And I'm thinking about these acts of taking over that occur within this demand for iconic sites that bring us back to the old-fashioned question of who has the right to the city. So in London, I've noticed film productions, when they enter a space after negotiating a whole regime of permits, or at least that's what you assume as a local, because they basically take over the area with their presence, large trucks, equipment, signage and barriers. A cordon of wraparound materialities, which include physical barriers erected on the streets to cordon the area off, marshals and stewards to check documentation. You need to actually prove you live in a property that is part of the cordoned area before you can even enter your own home. And what I've noticed is that there's minimal interaction with the local economy as they come with their food trucks, their employees, their food. Whilst those on the margins, let alone those who are local, fail to benefit in any appreciable way. And you could say locals are inconvenienced. But as you've noted in your presentation and in your work, some are more inconvenienced more detrimentally than others. So here I'm also thinking about what you talked about, this demand for fresh locations. But also I maybe want to focus on this idea of iconic sites, both in London and Lagos. But in London, it seems to, in central London, because I live near central London and I work at UCL, University College London, which is right in the centre and is near one of these, is actually surrounded by squares which are periodically cordoned off to make period dramas. But at the same time, where I live in London, I live near one of what is considered the most iconic working class cafe. So its interior, particularly in its interior, it's seen as representing traditional working class values. And from time to time, our local cafe stops being our local cafe as the film crews move in and the truck drivers are chased away. Because it's actually very popular with truck drivers because they serve huge portions. So as I was saying, in these historic centre, you get many productions for period dramas. And they bring in the horses, the carriages, period drama costumes in full display. And here the emphasis seems to be on fixing the past, not blowing it up. And I think about this particular brand of tradition that's valorized and ossified, and the meanings which are attached to wealth and privilege that are reinforced through these historic dramas. And I'm particularly struck when I've seen the whole productions trucks and everybody move in into central London, for example, is you always notice, because in the stairwells of these, I don't know if any of you have been to central London, in these kind of period dramas, there's always a stairwell into the basement. And in these stairwells, you often, if you look on your way to work, you'll see a mattress or a cardboard pallet, just an indication that this is actually someone's space where they sleep in the night. And it's really quite moving that you'll find beyond the cordoned area, these wooden pallets and these old ruined mattresses are just stacked up and just kept out of the frame of this luxury period drama setting. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that this is actually someone who's usually not in our radar, those of us rushing off to university, who've got stable jobs, stable incomes. But somebody else also shares that space with us, that same space that's kept out of the frame. And I feel that there is a demand to tell stories of an idealized past, whether that be of the landed gentry or the English working class. And this constant reiteration of certain narratives seems to cement a story of the past that is told and retold in the same way and from some quite fixed perspectives. And I think about the fact that in many of these period dramas, there's infrequently, you might find it, but there is usually no storyline on the lives of those who live in the streets, London's very real homelessness issue, which has always been there since the founding of the city. They seem to remain forever invisible. And I think there seems to be a real tension there. On the one hand, as you have shown, documentaries seeking edgy sites about marginalized communities in sites that are considered representative of this kind of lifestyle are also really the spaces where the homeless, the undocumented, the refugees might seek shelter. But at the same time, as you've shown in your work, this renders them vulnerable to further displacement, and they have to be on the move again and seek another corner for shelter and security. When I shift my thinking to Lagos in Nigeria, which is, some of you might know the statistic, it's one of the most it is, I think, actually the most populous city in Africa with 20 million people and counting. I'm aware that there has been a very real struggle for the majority poor who really keep the city on the move through their cheap labor and the services they provide. I'm struck by the resonances with your work, IPEC, where poor people, as in my research, are really rendered invisible even when they seem to be the focus of our work. And I've actually worked with activists in Lagos who really tried to put a stop to what they consider to be poverty tourism, where film and documentary crews or development aid workers or projects that are supposed to empower people through participatory photography, for example, come into these spaces and they make films and they make these projects which are exhibited and are for audiences in the global north predominantly. And somehow in the beauty of the imagery, they re-eroticize or exoticize. That's actually a typo, but could be something to think about as well. The daily struggles of poor people in Africa. In poor neighborhoods in Lagos, despite people's precarity, they are very well informed, the poor. Maybe it is the very fact of their precarity that keeps them well informed to the possibility of being exploited. They have seen it all before, as well as the possibility of earning some income, however small. If you enter a neighborhood as a stranger, news travels fast. A strange foreigner in a neighborhood is regarded suspiciously. It is almost impossible as a foreigner and a stranger researcher to photograph or film in a slum neighborhood without paying a fee. Most foreigners work with local assistants, and many documentary filmmakers and journalists need the services of a fixer, someone to liaise between them and local communities. Poor people, I found, are very aware of the potential to exploit them. They've had these experiences, and many recounted their suspicions to me using examples of past interactions with researchers like myself, undertaking work or sometimes seeking to make a film with them. These neighborhoods that may seem empty of official governance and abandoned and only full of poverty are in fact very governed from the street up to the royal palace. And I think really good productions, there can be something like a good production, need to consider not only to pay the requisite fees and permits, but find ways to contribute to the local economy, to really ask those invisible people what their priorities are, let alone purchase food and refreshments and offer employment opportunities. So I just want to pose maybe 3 questions into the room and to IPEC and my other fellow panelists. Is really, if we think about the fact of people who have no social safety net and precarity is their norm, and this really, I think, like you touched upon, is not just about the undocumented and the migrants, it's also about people working in the location scouts who are kind of working in this gig economy of self-employment. You know, is it unsurprising that so many decades later we still have to think about these discussions and arguments about the right to the city? You know, who has a right to the city, but in what, and you know, where are the limits, really? So really that links to the second question of the continual harm and potential harm of these productions which we enjoy on our screens, on Netflix. So there's a demand from these audiences and from the machinery of payment on demand, but you know, at what cost? And then really thinking about that, maybe also the same question, but really thinking of it with an ethical or moral imperative. Is there an ethical or moral imperative, you know, for us as researchers, for production scouts, you know, who have to continually negotiate, carrying out their professional duties, but at the same time understanding, as you shared in your quotes, the vulnerabilities of marginal groups. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Nalu, thank you. Asma, can I ask you to respond?
Sure. I really enjoyed IPEC's presentation, and thank you, Nalu and Feneke. for this great panel. So I try to talk and also to a little bit discover the debate from the urban part. So I think that IPEC's debate interestingly explores the ways that European cities, which I put neoliberal renovation process, appears in and shaped by films and TV series. And the segments of IPEC's lecture made me to think more about the gentrification of historical neighborhood, the abandoned industrial areas, and their increasing use of abandoned post-industrial areas as shooting locations, and their promotion of spaces associated with creative industries. So also I would like to kind of, I think that IPEC's work showing how these images and this image making are connected to the urban branding and city making. So I think that when we want to talk about the idea of the place branding or the place management, this process requires the local support and also enhancing the private and public collaboration and also engaging with audiences around the world. So specifically, I would like to see that how these TV and film productions can communicate cities' identities, highlight these urban identities, and impact this regeneration of neighborhoods and urban branding. And I'm also interested to see how the city officials and also the media producers articulate an urban brand through these cinematic productions. So here I try to put some of my personal observation from the cities that I used to live. So I was part of the Torino Film Festival and also Venice Biennale and also Berlin Film Festival, and before the pandemic, the Porto Film Festival. I'm interested to ask IPEC and other audience to also think about these film festivals and how they're working as the kind of motors for this urban branding and urban identity. I think it's important to note that because it's a large network of different stakeholders and different parts of the societies and engaging. And each of these, film festivals, I'm sure that we can also relate that to the Amsterdam and also to the Dutch community in Rotterdam and Amsterdam. Today we talked with Nalu about this documentary festival in Amsterdam that's happening. How all of these actors are working together. I think that it's also related to IPEC's discussion. Also, some personal observation from the Iranian cinema I had, and also its association with the urban places. So the dichotomy between the private and public is not the same, and it doesn't have the same story as the Western. So in movies, most of the movies, at least coming from my out of my head and the kind of the memory that I have, the visual memory that I have from my childhood, the discourse of urban life that is pictured in Iran is mostly inside, mostly about the closed spaces. You can trace them, at home, workplace, place of education, hospitals, but in closed spaces. So not that much you can engage with the, kind of public or outer spaces. I think that's very important difference, that how the film producer in other countries try to relocate themselves. And also I think because of these paradoxical, patterns in the society, it also happens in the process of filmmaking. So the idea of that, kind of urban place as the public place that's happening in the Western or European cinema that IPEC mentioned, it's not happening in all of the places. So it's just some personal observation. And then I went through the IPEC's work, and it reminds me the Tarkovsky's film. I'm not sure if you have ever watched it, back to 1979. And it was exactly about the artistic representation of this post-industrial urbanism, which was, kind of, at that time, it was kind of originated from a post-Soviet and post-industrial genre of photography. And for me, this Tarkovsky film and camera and the way he tries to talk about this poetically charged landscape of industrial ruins and also about the abundant artifacts and maybe contaminated landscape. For me, it's kind of a point zero. I'm not sure if you have ever watched it. But this ruin aesthetic that I think that Ipek introduced in her presentation, I followed the same in Tarkovsky's film. And it was like about the abandonment, architectural decay, and also this urban failure. And I think this new visual language to represent the landscape and the built environment, and it's kind of introducing the post-urban, the post-industrial condition is trying to kind of engage with the suggestions that Ipek has in the film location and then choosing them. And so in Tarkovsky's movie, you can see these ruins of a power station destroyed during the Second World War. And nearby was an abandoned oil refinery, which is so fascinating when you see that in the movie, and a working paper mill, and which was actually shooted in a functioning power station in central Tallinn. So what I would like to mention here is that these post-industrial places are always in flux, either regenerative through natural succession or transformative through socio-economic or technical endeavor. And I think that this the Stalker movie by Tarkovsky prompts our imagining how quickly we could slip into post-oil, post-economic collapse, or some other prelude to dystopia or apocalypse kind of era. During times of conflict, economic crisis, as Ipek mentioned, related to these post-industrial locations, and also geopolitical uncertainty, as in today or at the close of the Cold War, such scenarios are all the more disturbing. So Tarkovsky's cinema addresses the built and natural environments as temporal subjects and not merely as scenery. This was the movie that I would like to share, because I think that it's so much related. And also the other one that I think maybe some of you watched is the Peaky Blinders, and I think by Netflix. Yeah, and it was just taking to the streets of Liverpool and Sheffield, and it was just happening into the Britain's vanished industries, and try to kind of put again this debate that why the Britain's post-industrial cities are attractive places, and also their industrial character persists even as they evolve beyond heavy industry and the years of economic depression that followed its demise. So instead, there remain plenty of disused factories and warehouses awaiting regeneration. It didn't happen. And so these spacious places were ideal for the film, for the shooting and for the film production industry. And also it could help diversify the economy as well. And finally, I have the further questions and maybe some suggestions or points that I want to ask from Ipek, Nalu, Feneke, and also the audience. And I'm interested to ask about these liminal stages of this post-industrial site, because it seems that it's something between inside and out, and also about the temporalities that they are, having. It seems that they are in between past, present, and future. And I want to just ask you to think about these characteristics about these post-industrial sites and how this adaptive reuse of them by the film production industry is happening. And also I want to ask that we discussed, and can we just kind of think about our lessons learned here about to be thinking about the other contexts, mostly non-European contexts, about the cities in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America? Can we just have the same, kind of suggestions for all the cities around the globe? I want to know about the other contexts, how it's working for them. And also, and finally, how can we trace the different modes of resistance to the established norms and structures blended into the rhythms of everyday life, as Ipek talked about the refugees, Nalu talked about marginalized group in the film production, and also the idea of the right to the city that I think Nalu just well described. So these are the further questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asma. Well, let's start a conversation also with you in the audience. People at home, please use hashtag NIAStalk to pose your questions, and they will be dealt with here. So before starting to respond to the great questions that both Nalu and Asma raised about who has the right to the city, which is a very pertinent, concise summary perhaps of what you have described, and indeed how do these ideas, or how does this work out, these practices in non-European contexts? I think that's also very interesting to hear a little bit more about. But there are 2 or 3 things that it makes me think of, and that is that I live on the Mercatorplein in Amsterdam-West. I'm not sure if you are already familiar in Amsterdam. And there artists come to my square and they put wonderful images, stills from film, movies on huge banners on the square. And every time that I walk there, I ask myself, what are they trying to teach us? And what are the assumptions that the artists have about the people who live in this area? And there are 2 things, I think, related to what all of you have touched upon, that on the one hand, filmmakers or artists enter a neighborhood to just make their movie, but on the other hand, they also try to do something for the neighborhood. Sometimes, not always, obviously. And indeed, where is this limit between taking over or a kind of paternalizing gesture, like you are living in this neighborhood and we feel that you need some art or culture here? And I very much, I think that we can all relate to that, indeed, with your cafe in central London, that with a neighborhood comes an identity and all these kinds of assumptions that are then portrayed in movies and images, and it becomes a life in itself. So would you like to respond to...
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for your wonderful responses. Indeed, especially film is a little different from television series, because television series, at least it does take a while, so it's much more ingrained maybe in the neighborhood economy, but film comes and goes, comes and exits, and then it doesn't really leave much. And when you consider, for instance, in the Netherlands and almost in all European countries, and sometimes in each European city, there's these film commissions, and they give huge amounts of either tax rebates or cash money for the producers. So we're talking about, I checked this for the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands Film Foundation gives 30% cash rebate based on the figures that, for instance, a production company says we're spending 100,000, and that's very low, right? 100,000 euros to produce this film here. So 30% of this is given back to the company as a cash rebate, and this is basically taxes of you that are given back to these usually American film companies. And do they spend this money on actually the Dutch economy? Well, most of the time that's debatable, because they spend the money usually on, for instance, hotels and catering. And hotels are like, we're talking about Hilton, for instance. We're talking about international companies. So it's very debatable that this money is actually going back to the economy of the city, at least in full. But there's right now in hundreds of film commissions that give thousands of taxpayers' money to these international productions. But what I'm talking about is these big productions, right? I mean, I'm not talking about the artists who actually go and do these, but that's also in response to cities as branding themselves, something that Asma mentioned. But with regard to different permits, different cities have different permit regimes. Some cities don't even ask, some neighborhoods don't even ask the people who live there. In Istanbul, nobody is asked really. The city gets their money. The police doesn't block anything. So it's usually the screen workers, the media workers who are like, please don't park here, don't park, you know, so it's actually their extra work. They work. And the TV economy in Turkey is really, I don't know if you know about Turkish TV series, but it's big, and their working hours are very long and very exploitative. So indeed, usually when the city doesn't chip in, it falls on the shoulders of the workers who have to work extra hours to make sure there's not much bothering of the residents, and also it falls on the residents because basically it inconveniences them without bringing much to the local economy. But when we talk about non-European places, just one more example maybe from Istanbul. When I talked to screen workers, they said there's different difficulties when they work on lower class neighborhoods and sort of upper class neighborhoods, because they work in both, right? And they do work in closed spaces as well as public spaces. They said we can do whatever we want in the house of a lower class resident usually, because if something happens, we'll just pay and get away with it. But if something happens with the house of the upper class resident, they're going to take us to court. They're going to appeal to law. But with the lower class, we can just pay our way. But then again, it could be issues with when the road is blocked. The upper class neighborhood resident can say, I'm going to tell the police. The lower class residents, actually, there has been instances, and I'm talking about the experience of screen workers really, where they had to, where they got into a fight with the residents and they had to defend themselves with the equipment. So there's really, it's like they're producing something and they're putting their bodies to work. And when we talk about ethical implications, I figured, as I talked more and more with screen workers, in the beginning I was interested really in how they have an impact on the city. But then the more stories that I got, the more their own precarity actually came out. So I started to become interested in their own labor conditions. So the precarity of the space, the precarity of the residents actually also resonates this precarity of the screen workers. So indeed, there's this kind of parallel precarities at work here.
Yeah, so Ipek, because I also want to open it up if there are questions or remarks from the audience, but also intuitively, so this is what I really like about your work and also about your responses, is that there are so many layers and contradicting or coinciding problems that come together in this space where this film is shot or the TV series is made. But intuitively or naively, one could also say it's great for a neighborhood. A television, you know, this TV, the crew comes in, they bring life, they bring a new experience, the local population can perhaps serve as an extra in the background. Is it always bad?
Of course, it's not always bad, but the residents, oftentimes residents might not be necessarily happy with the way they're represented. And especially regarding low-income neighborhoods, for instance, people were actually complaining about the way they're stereotyped in the films that I explored. And I'm not only exploring films, I'm exploring the neighborhood. Of course, I didn't interview. One thing that's missing in my research, I didn't really interview the people, the residents, in the way that they experience the film shooting. I only looked at the news, and my relationship with them is news-based. But basically, first of all, the complications related to the way they're represented. For instance, in French banlieues, oftentimes they're represented as terrorists, and that they say, well, we've been in a very peaceful neighborhood for 20 years. What's wrong? Why are you representing our neighborhood in such and such way? And then, of course, it brings some labor, but then it moves out very quickly. And will it bring any more labor? So it's not a very, often it's not a very sustainable economy. Even in Belfast, for years and years, they shot Game of Thrones, and it created a lot of labor, but labor like what? Extras. Most of the people were extras. So we're talking about labor that is being created is usually very kind of low in the level of hierarchy, because we're talking about high-end productions. They want very, very professional people. And I talked to people who wanted to for years, local people who for years they have wanted to work in Thrones, they called, but they couldn't because they were considered as having not enough experience. So even though there's a claim that these economies come and even train people, well, actually that's the amount of people, the number of people is very little, and often they're used as extras, which is okay for that particular time or maybe a couple of years, and then that's it. Yeah. Then that leaves. Yeah. So the problem is not, it's not sustainable usually.
Are there any questions here for Ipek or Nalu or Esma or online?
Well, maybe it touches a little bit upon what you just mentioned, Ipek, but what happens to these cities or locations when the crews leave? Can you tell me anything? Like, you mentioned something in your presentation about how some films can be an archive of what those locations used to look like, but what happens when the crews leave and the places are empty again, so to say?
Usually film shooting, what's great about film and TV is that it can, and what I argue is that it actually can start cultural regeneration, because usually a lot of urban scholars explore cultural regeneration through museums, places that are more permanent. Obviously a museum changes a whole neighborhood, right? But what happens before the museum comes there? Before that museum is built, when the factory was still in ruins, film can go in, photography can go in, an artist can go in and do whatever and go out. So these temporary productions usually bring other temporary productions, because they know location scouts, even though they want to find fresh locations, they also, because they know how it's like, once they go to a place, they'd like to go again and again and again. And the fact that gradually this place or the neighborhood attracts a certain attention. And then, it leads to, and there's cases that I'm looking at in Istanbul where a factory that was bought, let's say, for 5 euros was then gained, and after numerous film shootings that made this place more and more popular, became into a cultural sort of regeneration museum and exhibition place and everything, and then the value increased, skyrocketed. And then in the neighborhoods that I look at also, where slowly film production makes it visible, usually simultaneously urban regeneration is already there, but regeneration takes a long time. It's basically building structures and deconstructing and reconstructing. That takes a long time, and in the meanwhile it's always good to have some sort of culture economy going there and showing these places. If I am allowed, because there's one thing that Esma mentioned, and also bringing up Lagos, Nalu also mentioned, because I also talk a little bit about Syria and Palestine in my work. I found this very, very interesting petition signed by Syrian artists and filmmakers, actually against filmmaking in deconstructed cities in Syria. They were basically, what happened is that the Lebanese filmmaker, an art film that gained awards in Venice Film Festival, talk about festivals, about the destruction of war in Lebanon. It was shot in war-destroyed town in Syria. Basically, just the idea of getting a permit from the Syrian government is problematic. And basically, these people whose houses are destroyed, it's not their story. It's the story of other people whose houses are destroyed. And the director says, well, it's about the human condition and war and trauma. But there's a problem, because the process, what's going on as the film is being shot, is being regeneration, and the government is seeking legitimacy for what it's doing in this place. So it's a very problematic kind of relation. So it's, as you said, it's important to talk about other locations as well. And we're talking about not only now in 1980s in Israel, Palestine, in Haifa, for instance, an Arab neighborhood was used to stand for Beirut in a war called Delta Force, which is sort of this very anti-Arab kind of war, film, supposedly terrorists attacking. So, but it's Palestinian neighborhood that is being used and exploded and everything, and then basically they have no voice.
Yeah. What would be your take on that?
Yeah, that's important point, and I think that we need to be able to go through this process. I mean that you talked about petitions, so I think that rather than just coming from the legitimacy of the governments, it should be kind of coming from the bottom-up process. Who decides on that? I mean, who again, whose cities? I mean, I think that the different actors we have here, and it's important to give the voice to the unheard voices, rather than the. But I don't know how this process is happening. But I've been also heard about this, the idea of having these petitions, for this war, kind of filming this difficult location and contested locations.
How is that for you? What do you think of this?
Well, if I go back to Lagos, I've worked there predominantly on photography. Yeah. And what I've, alongside, if you want to say, are there any positive stories, and this self-awareness of this kind of access to, one of the issues is resources, and what scholars and production companies and galleries, and as well as development agents, because they're also in this art space as well, making films and making art, is that they come with resources, they come with equipment. And so I mean, I know of two initiatives whereby a local photographer, one started what's called the Iwaya Festival. So his neighborhood, he's born and brought up in this slum neighborhood. He's a photographer now, gaining repute, but he's also working with the younger generation, running workshops. And so it's slightly different because it's grassroots orientated. They are plugged into this aesthetic of the ruin or the aesthetic of poverty, but they're saying we're reclaiming our own neighborhoods to tell our stories our way, because at the end of the day we actually live here, we're born and raised here. It's not, we don't see it with the eyes of a slum, we see it with the eyes of our home, and tell the stories from that perspective. And there's another one which is the Lagos Biennale, and now what they do is they tend to actually again use abandoned properties in the city, and whether it's the old railway station in Lagos, in near Yaba, using the old abandoned railway carriages as part of the exhibition space. But in that way, similar to what you said, incrementally, the space that even to the locals seemed to be like a dead space starts to be reclaimed in different ways, but really because the initiative is recognized as grassroots. The people who are organizing it, who are running it, are seen as part of the community. And then, of course, money follows success. So then the funders come in, and then a new process of negotiation has to happen again. Yeah.
Yeah, so it also made me think, and I think this is a really important aspect also in your slides about the Stanley Kubrick movie about the Vietnam scene of blowing up this building, which was in London, I believe. So the question is then, should he have gone? Well, was it better if he had gone to Vietnam to shoot this movie on the Vietnam War? And so it made me think about a movie that was shot in Paramaribo in Suriname. I've seen you, and I know some actors who played in that movie, and the movie was called How Expensive Was the Sugar, based on a book, really that deals from a Surinamese author that deals with the period of slavery. And I know from the actors and some of my family members that still live in Paramaribo that it was really for the local population, because they were all engaged as extras in the movie, that it really was very intense, because it was like they relived a past that they weren't really a part of in the past, but it was about their about their grandparents, and it was very it was a kind of it brought the local population together, if only for a while, and they really started talking about their collective past and all these memories.
I'm not actually saying that all productions should go to that particular place, and all productions about Beckton needs to be about the workers that worked in the Beckton. It's just that most of the time directors and producers do this without thinking, or do totally appropriate the place and not pay attention to what they're doing for the purpose of the high art. I mean, I'm always thinking of this director, young Greek film director, who went into this airport, and he said, shoot a film about it's a sci-fi film, but then most of the film is shot, the airport was used as an airport, but then it was used as a refugee camp. And then the refugees were pushed away by the government, were taken somewhere else, I believe, and then their belongings were still there. And the director was so proud to say that I was the first person to go in and make this film in this place but then it's quite a progressive production. So this whole language of we blow it up, we do this, we get there, we take, it's, for me, it's a kind of appropriation, even temporary, that doesn't quite think of the consequences or the people who were actually kicked out. Am I appropriating someone's actually tent? I'm filming the tent, but God knows where this person is right now. And all in the name of...
That indeed refers to what you said about the word scout, that as if you discovered an area that is already part of a whole group's lives and past, has a past.
Scouts are very interesting people.
There is a question in the back.
Yeah, just something about Fenneke, about what you said about going to Vietnam to shoot Vietnam. Very often film is make-believe, and of course especially in the period dramas that Nalu was also mentioning. So it's very often, it's much more convincing or realistic or authentic, between brackets, to shoot in a completely different location and pretend it is something that you may know very well, because the authentic isn't there anymore. While it still exists in some other place and is much more convincing and appealing to our ideas, or because that's all what it's all always about. It's more appealing to our idea, our vision, or what it should be, whether it's in the past or in science fiction in the future, so to say. So we have something in our head, and filmmakers are also dealing with that, so to say, creating kind of vision, creating a certain image. And that is very often conflicting, of course. But to get back to also what Nalu said, this idea of a complete caravan of trucks that pass by like locusts, they come and go, and then you ask yourself afterwards, what did you get, like Sarah also said. But perhaps you should mention something like cinematic tourism, which is enormously popular. There are maps being distributed, how to visit the locations of certain films all over the globe, basically. And that is, okay, there are benefits, there are also bad sides to it, but that's absolutely a phenomenon of our times.
Thank you. There's another question, a final question, and then we have to wrap it up. Yeah?
Thank you very much. I'm happy because you mentioned Syrian case, the ruins, Lebanese civil war, what's happening also in Palestine. And also, I'm wonder if you see you mentioned already some Syrian movie of some movies about Syria, Lebanon, what happened. Do you think that these films reflect the good image about the problems, conflicts of Syria or Lebanon or Palestine? And do you think that was in the concern of the producers for the film, trying to reflect some facts about what's happening in that conflict? And do you think also the moral aspect was in concern also as background in working in that movies? Because I see I don't remember what the name of films. He mentioned something about Syria, but actually the shooting was in Lebanon in 30 years ago. All mentioned something about Palestine, but actually was from Syria or from Afghanistan. Do you think this shooting also in the ruins and the producers also taking in their account some moral aspect, or trying to serve the places they try to exist or shoot in their movies? Thank you very much.
I just briefly respond. I mean, one place in the Middle East usually very easily stands in for another place in the Middle East, and that's very standard. That's what all of my interlocutors, location scouts said. Oh, we just put a tent in a place where refugees are in Istanbul these days, especially regeneration sites in Istanbul and empty buildings where usually Syrian refugees reside, are used to film Syria, because they cannot go to Syria. And there's cheap extras in there, so it's an interesting dynamic. But I cannot talk about all the films, all the productions. I mean, some of them. But my problem is even the productions that have the most progressive agenda can actually be hurtful in the way in their production politics. I mean, the way they represent people can be the most progressive, but what we need to look at is usually the invisible production politics that hopefully are also equally progressive in the way they treat the people who are working in the production, the people who live in the where the production is taking place. So this is kind of my concern.
Thank you so much. I'm sad that we already have to wrap it up because I noticed that I have a lot of more questions to ask. But we won't keep you much longer, especially at home. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. And I think the main takeaway, for me at least, I've learned a lot about all these dynamics that are at play. But what I've heard also from the audience's questions is the importance of this ethical imperative. So think about where you go and why there and who are already living there and what is happening on the ground, working together with grassroots, bottom-up groups, and also the stigmatization and the place branding at the same time. You know, you can brand a place by stigmatizing the population, the current population. So many more things to discuss. Thank you, Ipek, for your wonderful talk. Thank you, Nalu. Thank you, Esma, for your wonderful responses. Thank you here in the audience and at home for your presence. And we'll see each other hopefully at the next NIAS talk in a month. Thank you all.